Hello, everybody. All right. So we're going to be getting started here dead on 3 o'clock because this is a very long presentation. There's a lot of stuff in here. I may have overpromised how much I could deliver. So we're going to do our best to get through as many tips and tricks as we possibly can. For anyone that doesn't know me, my name is Chris Murphy, and I'm an Unreal Engine evangelist. I typically handle Australia, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia, but my job is helping developers all across the region. So, watch it. Okay, that's how we lose a banner. Okay, so my job is generally helping out teams across the world. It's kind of a strange one, and in my travels, there's a lot of stuff that I constantly see teams being unaware of. So for today, I'm going to be running through a lot of points that are to help you better understand some of the smaller intricacies that we have in the engine that people are unfamiliar with. Now, as we go through this, I'm going to warn you, first off, the content is a little bit chaotic. The reason it's a little bit chaotic is that as you take notes, the next topic will be something completely different quite often, which hopefully gives you a little bit more time to take a note that was relevant to you. We are going to go reasonably quickly, so again, my apologies, but there's a lot of information I'd really love to go through. Now, the first thing that I really want to touch on is this common issue of console commands. Everyone is aware that Unreal Engine has console commands in it, but quite often you don't know what the right console command actually is. And now, many people are unaware that if you go to Help, you can click Generate Console Commands. And clicking Generate Console Commands actually gives you a searchable HTML page that has every console command in the engine. And as well as that, if you check that little box that says Search Tips as well, so down the bottom here, Search Help as well, it'll not only include keywords from the name, but also include keywords from the description. So if you're working on, say, something like landscapes, and you're aware of it being likely that there's a console command to do with landscapes, you can just type in the word landscape, and hopefully you'll find something that'll actually help you out. Now, the next thing I want to bring up is kind of one of the awkward things that many people are unaware of, which is, let's face facts. When we all got into game development, we were all probably terrible at game development math. Now, in the content examples, if you open up the level called Math Hall, the level Math Hall actually contains tons of just game development math, like all of your standard game development math functions, and then next to each function and explanation, it has a real-world example of every single thing. So if you have come into game development and you're seeing words like frac or clamping or saturating or vector, and you're going a bit cross-eyed and you're not sure what these things are meant to be, the Math Hall is excellent because it'll give you a breakdown on vectors, 2D vectors, how to calculate distances between particles, 3D vectors, how a 3D vector can be normalized and what that even means. And then we can work through a whole bunch of other stuff. So this is free. It's just in the Learn tab of the editor. And again, a lot of people come into game development, especially technical artists that started off as artists, and they're not aware of a lot of these math principles. So having something to fall back on here is really great. Now, when it comes to the discussion of Blueprint, Blueprint helps different development disciplines work together, okay? It's very, very useful for making sure that artists and programmers and designers and everybody else can really work with one another. But one thing that's really, really important is that when you're bringing artists and designers into the fold, when you're bringing them together, we strongly recommend that you make sure that your artists and your designers have a mentor that is an engineer that they can constantly just sync with and talk to, and make sure they have someone that they can approach on the team to say, yes, this is the right thing to do, or no, you should approach it in a different way. Otherwise, your blueprints can get out of hand very, very, very quickly. So again, making sure that you've got someone that every week or two is going to go through and audit what the artists and designers have done is a strong benefit. Next one is a very simple one, but if you use the middle mouse in your orthographic viewports, it actually becomes a ruler. This is really useful because quite often you're just kind of approximating how big something is when you're resizing it. Just be aware that at any point you can simply just hold down the mouse and see how far a distance is. This is one of my personal favorites. So Alt middle mouse creates a temporary pivot point. If you Alt middle mouse on something, it'll briefly add a pivot point until you click away from it, at which point it will reset to its default pivot. This is really, really useful when, in this situation, you can see that sometimes you want to rotate this as if it was turned from one side, Pivot points really change depending on circumstance, and many people are unaware of this, and it's only 2 buttons. Next up is Control middle mouse. If you hold Control middle mouse and drag, up goes to top, down goes to back, left goes to, top, bottom, left, and right orthographic viewports. And if you go to the bottom left, that will go back to a perspective camera. This means that you don't actually have to open up the 4 windows and click on the one that you actually want. You can do it much, much quicker by simply dragging. Next is a little one, but useful, shift drag. So shift drag is when you hold down shift while dragging an object around, it will drag your camera with it. And by dragging your camera with it, you don't have to do that awkward thing where you drag the actor, move the camera, drag the actor, move the camera until it's in the correct spot. This is a nice way to just be able to move those things together. So very, very useful. Now, another one here is Control left mouse, Control right mouse, and Control both mouse can be used without touching the widget itself. So if you use Control left mouse, it will just move things along the x-axis. Control right mouse will just move things along the y-axis, and you don't need to actually grab that widget itself. So this just saves a little bit of time. I know it sounds silly to be like, you don't have to drag your mouse all the way over there. But in all honesty, when you spend all day in an editor, it's kind of nice not having to click on the thing and then accidentally click on something else, and you know how it gets. Now, another one that's worth noting here is Control tilde. So Control tilde switches between world space and local space. So if local space, for anyone that's unfamiliar with it, is the idea of space relative to that actor. And you'll see that when we switch to local space, we're now able to drag along its own x and y axes. And this is just really useful. And just, if I was setting up pipes or something like that along a building, this is a much cleaner and more efficient way to go about doing that. Now, another one here is scrolling. So while you're moving around by holding right-click and using W, A, S, and D, it's worth noting that the scroll wheel can modify your speed just at that instantaneous moment. So by scrolling up and scrolling down, what you're actually getting is faster or slower speed just to easily move around the map. I see a lot of people kind of clicking up there and changing their scroll speed, then moving and then changing it back. Nah, scroll wheel. End to snap actors to the floor. This is one key, and a lot of people just don't know that it exists. But if something's up and it needs to go down, click it. So some people are unfamiliar with the fact that you can actually split the viewport into any number of ways that you want. Sometimes the perspective that you look at something from and the perspective that you want to edit something from are actually completely different. So I personally like to actually use one camera. When both set to real time, set one camera to be the perspective that I want to preview it from, and then the other camera to be the nicest way to paint that type of stuff in, at which point you're left with a nice workflow where one of them can kind of draw things and work as necessary, and then the other one can really show you what that final result is going to be. Now, while we're looking at landscapes, let's cover another point here, which is the landscape grass node. So the landscape grass node creates output types that distribute instance meshes across a landscape. So what that means here is up top we have a grass sample, okay? So that grass sample says, look for anywhere in the landscape in which grass has been painted. Everyone's with me? Now, if we look over here on the right-hand side, you can see that the landscape grass node, I've created 2 outputs, one for flowers and one for grass. And then I'm feeding in a simple texture over here, and what that does is that says wherever it's black, put grass, but whenever it's white, put flowers. Now this means that from just a couple of material nodes, what we're left with is this. as I paint in grass, it will automatically add nodes. It'll automatically add grass meshes, and it will automatically break up that grass with nice little flower patterns so that it looks way more natural than just splatting grass everywhere. This kind of effect is super simple to add, and it makes your workflow so much quicker. And all of this grass is batch rendered. So all of this grass is a hierarchical instance static mesh, which means that it will correctly load down and correctly instance itself, which is nice. Now, whenever you're inputting a value, be aware that you can type equations into any of these. So in this case, if I said half, like 1 divided by 2 multiplied by 3, like I can type in complex equations. I can type in complex equations and actually get a result. This is really useful when... Do you ever get Americans that send you assets that were made in inches and you need to deal with them in centimeters? The worst. So when you can easily type in the equation to convert it from like a nonsense system to one that makes sense, that's useful. So being able to just kind of type that in, everyone's good. This is another little one. So this little button here says call in editor. You'll see that on the left-hand side, call in editor. Whenever you select an event and you type in, and you select call in editor, it actually automatically creates a button on the asset that will execute that. Now, a lot of people use construction scripts when they don't need to use construction scripts. Like a lot of things that are done in a construction script, like set a random color of the asset. Sometimes you want that to just be a simple button. You don't want to run it every single time. So being able to just simply tie that to here and push that across makes life a whole lot easier. Now, while we're looking at that call in editor, this is another nice thing. So you can draw materials to render targets, okay? You can render any material down to a texture. Okay? And what's cool is you can run those textures into landscapes. And what that means is if you want to, it's super easy to tell textures to generate landscapes and automatically import them as height maps or weight maps for different layers. This is really, really powerful, and it means you can get functionality similar to something like World Machine using material graphs, which is a space that I'm personally more comfortable working in. Here's another one. If you have physics objects in your world and you select them and hit K and then you stop simulating, they will save their final position. Okay, so if you have physics objects in the world, you can actually just use physics to place them in certain ways. You can go in and throw them around, eject and press K, and you can save their final position. This is really good if you have like a child's bedroom and you want to make a mess, or to be honest, even my bedroom, and you're trying to make a mess. I mean, all you need to do is go in there and physically just knock things over, and they'll end up in a more realistic way. You can then cache out that position, and you're fine. Now, when it comes to content in the content browser, interesting thing that a lot of people are unfamiliar with is the content browser actually supports advanced search syntax. So if you look up here, you can physically search through any metadata at all for any asset type, and use that to search to filter your searches. So if I wanted to go to the content browser and search for every 3D mesh that is over 30,000 polys with less than 1 LOD, I can do that. I can just say bam, and immediately get a list of things that might be troublesome in my build. And what's really useful here is that any metadata for any asset, all you need to do is remove the space that's in any of these words. So if it says UV channels as 2 words, just ditch the space and make UV channels as 1 term, and that's now something you can search for. And this is super useful because I know there are going to be a lot of people in this room that have been stuck with that job of auditing the team's content, and trying to get through it is quite frustrating, especially when you know there are general rules of what you're looking out for, like I'm looking for anything that's this material type, or I'm looking for any meshes that have this category. Being able to have this metadata searchable is very, very powerful. That said, I often actually don't use the content browser at all. Alt-Shift-O, I think Control-P also works. It's just a quick pop-up that you can automatically just type into that will open an asset. If I want to open a mesh and I don't want to browse through the content browser for it and reset all my filters because I already know the name, I can literally just hit Alt-Shift-O and start typing in the thing that I want. And then when I see that it's done, hit enter. In a weird way, it's kind of like treating the open process like more of a command line, which I'm sometimes more comfortable with. For anyone that's unfamiliar with it, Bluetilities are an experimental feature in UE4 that we typically have disabled by default. But Bluetilities actually let you create your own editor toolbars. Now this is really, really powerful stuff because if you, first off, it's very important that when you go to plugins, see this editor scripting utilities and Python editor script. You don't need the Python one, it's just letting you know it's there. But the editor scripting utilities plugin has a lot of extra functionality so that you can do things like render targets down, you can create static textures in various ways. There's a lot of really useful editor functionality that's actually hidden by default that you need to get by enabling that plugin. Now, like any Blutility is literally just set up through standard Blueprint script. In this case, it would be creating it, it would be swapping out all of the materials for certain types of assets. But it is worth noting that as of 4.22, we now have editor utility widgets. So editor utility widgets let you create your own interface, your own toolbars and your own widgets for the editor using UMG. So what that means you can do is in UMG, you can draw your own toolbars, you can put buttons down as you see fit, images or whatever else, and you can make tools that are appropriate to your game. And not only can you make tools that are appropriate to your game, you can make tools without having to bug a programmer, which is great. So it means that very simply, you can use render targets, for instance, to automatically draw an image of all of the patrol routes for all of your main characters, or you could do anything that's appropriate to your style of game. And again, it's just really powerful. When you can make tools that are right for you, super powerful. Now, the next thing I want to quickly go into is tick. So tick, for anyone that's unfamiliar with it, is the process of, is the process of updating any tickable actors in every frame. So what that means is every single time the game goes to update, it goes through and it processes all of the things that need to be ticked, and it runs that through, which is good because some things need to be ticked. The problem is that ticking is a sometimes thing. So what I mean by that is quite often people are ticking things that just don't need to be ticked. And what they're doing is they're just polluting their list of just all of these things. Like, I've gone to studios before to help them out, and I've found that they have 500 footprints being left behind the player, and every single footprint is ticking. Footprints don't need to tick. Okay, so finding ways to use, to avoid ticking is very powerful. So timelines, timers, manual toggling, or even just a polling versus an event-driven system, these things really help out. Now, if you want to find out what's currently ticking in your game, you can type into the console, dump ticks, okay? I forgot to put it on the slide, sorry. But dump ticks will output this text down here and literally say, there are this many ticking things and there are this many disabled ticking things. And quite often you'll open this up and you'll just be like, why is my grass ticking? And there'll be one artist somewhere who will say, well, I wanted it to do this. And you're like, no. So being aware that that's a thing is super powerful. What I strongly recommend is in your project settings, there's a little option that says, can blueprints tick by default? Okay? Now, if you turn this off, it means that anytime someone wants something to tick, they need to go to the default properties of the actor and enable ticking for that actor. Okay? And this is really, really useful on large-scale projects because it means you have to make a very conscious decision of, yes, this thing should be ticking and adding, like, more fat to my game. Okay? Now this here is a nice little design pattern that I really like to use. Quite often people think that they need to tick because they're making their object disappear or their object appear, They're getting their visibility value and they're changing it from 0 to 1. okay? But here's the thing. If you read into the material one time, the start time and the duration with this setup, let's follow what that would do. Let's say the game is 40 seconds into running, okay? So 40 seconds into running, and we wanted an effect to go from 0 to 1 over 10 seconds. If we read in the current game time, which is just a blueprint node, now if we read in 40 to start time and 10 for 10 seconds to affect duration, we would get time minus start time, which would be 40 minus 40, which would be 0. 0 divided by 10 is still 0, okay? So we would get a value of 0. Now, 5 seconds later, we would have 45 minus 40, which gets us a value of 5. 5 divided by 10 would get us a value of 0.5, okay? And if we follow this same logic through, 50 seconds in, we get 50 minus 40, divided by 10, we now get a value of 1. So what that actually means is the material will automatically handle all of the interpolation from 0 to 1 over that period of time, and the objects don't need to tick. This is really useful for things like footprints, because all of your footprints can just fade themselves out, and you set a timer to clear out all of the footprints that should be destroyed, and all of a sudden you've got hundreds of footprints no longer burdening your CPU with terrible, terrible overhead. Okay? So techniques like this are very, very powerful, and I strongly recommend you consider them. Now, if your performance is still bad, I strongly consider using dump hitches. So stat dump hitches is a little stat command, and what it literally does is you can actually set a value called t.hitch frame time threshold, which basically says, this is what is considered my game stuttering. If this value goes over this, you need to consider this a stutter. And what Unreal does is anytime the game stutters, it actually dumps every function that was currently running at that given moment. And this is just really useful when you're doing a playthrough, because when you're trying to catch a stutter, a lot of people are typically like looking at their stat results and looking at the things. But when the game physically says, here's where it stuttered and here's what happened, you can go, and figure it out. So very useful, simple command, but it's also one of the first things that I check. A little thing here, but I find super useful for workflow. You can set the color of any folder, okay? But more importantly, let's take a look at setting the color of folders. This is useful for when you want to say, hey, this is your area, or hey, anything in the red folders is getting deleted at the end of the prototype, so don't leave things in the red folders that you want to keep, or whatever it may be. But when you actually set colors, you use the Unreal Engine color picker, which is probably the most underrated tool that we have. So the color picker lets you physically drag any colors up to that top there to create a theme. And what's really cool is these themes are shared all across the build, and you can save these out as separate themes. So this is really good to make sure that like all of the colors for red team stay consistent between every light and every material and everything else. And all of my colors for blue team also stay consistent. Setting these up just, when you've got a lot of artists working on something, it's really nice to know that everyone's using the same red and not something that's pretty close to that kind of red, but who knows? Yeah, useful. Next up, we have the virtual camera. So the virtual camera is quite powerful. Essentially, when you run the virtual camera, which we have on display out there, what you can do is you can output the image from your machine to your iPhone, okay? Your iPhone uses ARKit and feeds its translation data and rotation data back to the computer, which moves accordingly. You can then save that data into Sequencer, which means you can do game cinematics that feel like they were shot with real cameras, even though it was just your phone. And this kind of helps avoid that token video game camera effect that we see where, do you know how in trailers, video games love to do that slow rotating camera around the action that just looks very indie? You can avoid that, and you can start doing more interesting camera work without having to be particularly good with like handling your curves. Little thing people are unaware of, if you hold control, you can grab the wire instead of just disconnecting it, and you can reconnect the wire to any point in the build. I know this is simple, but we have like engineers that have been with Epic for 15 years that don't know about this. So it's small stuff that's easy to miss. Also, whenever you want to create a variable, if you right-click on the output or input and you hit promote to variable, it will create a variable of the correct type without you having to create a variable and find it. It's just a little workflow thing, but it makes your life way easier. Now, Gauntlet is something that came out in 4.21. Gauntlet is Unreal Engine's automated framework system. This is very powerful because Gauntlet lets you automatically schedule tests that can deploy to every device at night. So overnight, Gauntlet can automatically deploy to all of your phones, your PlayStation, your Xbox, your PC builds, and whatever else. It can run any tests you want it to run. And then it can send reports back to you saying that, hey, there were hitches on this version of the game, or hey, this test failed and the AI were unable to get from point A to point B, or whatever else it may be. But Gauntlet is very powerful, and we've road tested it in both Paragon and Fortnite, so it is very well used. I strongly recommend checking this out for any larger teams, because it's very easy to not realize that this existed. Documentation, well, English documentation went up just a couple of days ago, so hopefully Korean documentation is soon to follow. When we made the boy and his kite demo in what was that? That was 2015 or 16? I can't remember. When we created the boy and his kite demo, one of the things that came into the experimental section of Unreal was actually the procedural foliage tool. So the procedural foliage tool lets you actually specify regions and say, given these rules, like these trees produce this many seeds and these trees can survive in the shade, etc., etc., it actually goes through and just kind of creates a forest. It's really, really powerful, and you can end up with really natural-looking areas because trees start to like spread correctly, and you end up with really, really natural-looking forests. It's a little tool that no one seems to know exists, but it can be pretty powerful, and it can save you hand-painting an entire forest. So check in. Now, visualization modes. Many people are aware of the standard ones, but one thing I really like to do is buffer visualization. Buffer visualization just shows you every single one of the buffers at that given time. And this is quite useful because often you'll open it up and you won't realize that these things were running on separate translucency, or you won't realize that, hey, some of my metal values weren't a 0 or a 1. There was some weird in-between value that you probably shouldn't have on your metal. Being able to quickly visualize that just immediately when you're like, something seems wrong, I personally find opening this up and go, that's what's wrong, is really powerful. You may not be aware of this as well, but you can hit Control-C on anything in the engine and paste it straight into Notepad, and it will paste as plain text. Two cool things there is you can change any of these values and paste it back into the engine if you want, but also it's kind of useful when you're helping out a friend trying to fix something, and then you find a fix, and instead of having to send them a file, you can just dump the text into Slack, and you're fine. It's just useful for passing things around every now and then. I like to bring attention to the free automotive materials that we released as part of the McLaren demo a couple of years ago. So the free automotive materials are just on the marketplace. You can open them up. I wanted to bring them up because a lot of people don't look at them because they're like, I'm not making cars. But the truth is when you have really nice samples of different kinds of plastics, different kinds of like carbon fiber and different forms of metal, just having those as a point of reference in engine that were done by Epic's artists is really powerful. Now, speaking of the free materials, I'd also like to flag the free Paragon assets. So, the free Paragon assets went live a little while ago after Paragon was cancelled. Rest in peace. After Paragon was cancelled, the characters are all on the marketplace for anyone to use, and they're free. But I suggest you look at them not just because, not just if you're a character artist, but all of the visual effects are there as well. there are some really, really solid effect demonstrations and materials and skin work that's been done there. These serve as incredibly useful points of reference. You know, having like literally Epic's AAA team using Epic's tools and like having that content as a reference point is very, very powerful. And any team that's getting into it, I strongly recommend they look at that, as well as things like the animation cycles. It's worth noting that the character of Shenbi has an animation blueprint to tie her together as well, so you can examine that too. A little thing, but if you hold V, you get vertex snapping. So objects will actually snap to the nearest vert. Again, this just makes quality of life easier. One thing that's really noteworthy with a lot of these weird shortcuts is, to be blunt, Epic make games. And because Epic make games, we have a lot of these little shortcuts, because when the people that are actually using the tools are also making the tools, quite often people will get frustrated, and you'll find there's a lot of functionality that exists that's not too many people know about. Now, the next one for us to cover is Pivot Painter. So Pivot Painter has been around for a little while. It's very, very powerful. It's a 3ds Max script that allows you to output sub-objects as data textures. Now what this means is, in the situation here, the data texture is actually saving out the hierarchy of the trunk, the branches, and the leaves. So we can then use that to like blow wind against them. And the materials are there, and examples of this are there. They're in the content examples map. But the scripts themselves, there's actually quite a few scripts. If you open up the engine build, there's a little folder called Extras, which has just 3ds Max scripts and Maya scripts and Visual Studio stuff. That's just little extras that we often use with our engine, so it's worth looking at that. But in this situation, we're using the hierarchies to get more realistic blowing on the 3D assets, those are the foliage assets. But also, if you look in the corner of the section that's just coming up, we've actually used the data texture for every plank in a building. See this over here? The material is building that building using just the data texture. So that's completely being done in the material. Let's have a better look at something like that. So if you look at something like this entire like turret is being created and destroyed by using a data texture that was baked out from bottom to top. And we can then say move those objects in one by one and interpolate them so that they look like they're kind of just coming out of air. And the thing is that the effect that you're left with when you do something like this is a much, much nicer effect than just your token video game, scale up the object and now it exists like effect, right? So when you can do something like this, it's not that much extra work. And it's not much extra work, but with a really, really like polished feeling payoff. And it's one of those things that not many teams really do. And this is just world position offset. So in this situation, world position offset is, for anyone that's unfamiliar with it, is a material. It's a material link that allows you to move the vertices of any object around. So in this situation, we're just fading them from one position to another while we're also introducing object scaling. So this works quite well. And again, we have a reasonably close version of this in the content examples in the Pivot Painter 2 level. So I strongly recommend you look at that if you want to do work like this. Do we have any mobile developers in the room? A couple of hands going up. A little bit of a delay. So for mobile developers, it's worth noting that there's actually a bunch of features that are disabled by default that are enabled for that you can use for mobile. If you go to your plugins menu and do a search for the word mobile, for some reason they're not under the category of mobile, like only one of them is. But if you do a search for mobile, you'll see that there's a bunch of extra stuff. So all of a sudden, if you enable these optional mobile features, you can start getting your sound volume, your battery level, your temperature, as well as location services. So you can get much more information coming into your game, and they're turned off by default. Now the next one that I want to touch on here is Robo Recall. So Robo Recall is a game that was made, it's a VR game that we made alongside Oculus for the CV1, okay? Now, RoboRecall really helped us get a lot of stuff together for VR. But if you go to the Epic Games store, there's actually a RoboRecall mod kit. Now, the RoboRecall mod kit is really, really useful. The thing that you need to remember is that the mod kit is all of our blueprints and our art assets and everything else. It's an actual build that you can open up and look at what we did, okay? But what's really important to know about this is that everyone thinks of RoboRecall mod kit as being only an example that would be useful if you're making a VR game. And what they forget is that RoboRecall has a ton of bad guys. So it's actually a really, really good use case to see how we efficiently use the forward renderer, but also, more importantly, behavior trees. We don't really have too many samples for behavior trees at the moment. Typically, behavior trees are quite, they're a bit hard to get used to when you first start working with them. So having an actual example of shipped AI that you can look at and examine how behavior trees are meant to get put together is a really, really powerful thing. And again, it's free, so like, do it. So being able to go through all of these behavior is quite powerful. What I'd strongly recommend you look at as well is not only do we use behavior trees effectively, but we also use the environmental query system. So the environmental query system, or EQS, is an experimental feature we've had in the engine for quite a long time. And what it actually lets you do is generate points around anything in the game, any context that you want to generate points around. We can then get every single point that we've got and run query tests for every single point. Now what this means is in only a couple of tests, which are just simple nodes, I could give every single point in the world a rating and then move myself to that point. So I could use the AI and say, hey, I want to generate points around the last location that we saw every enemy. And then I could say to it, okay, given all of the points that I can't see, let's score every single point against how close they are to me to get to. And then let's also score them against the distance from the point that we saw them. And let's also score them against whatever else, how much cover there is or anything else we want to have. And immediately I can give my AI some super intelligent seeming behavior because without much work at all, with literally only a couple of clicks, I can end up with AI doing really intelligent hide and seek behavior that's always trying to find the best hiding place and always trying to find the most likely position that they could have searched, you know. So having EQS is super powerful. And not too many people use it because it's disabled by default. You've got to enable it in the experimental section of the editor. Now the next one that I want to touch on is split screen support. So you may be unaware of this, but if you call the create player node, and also in the project settings, you can reassign gamepad 1 to player 2. It takes one click to get split screen working. You can press it a couple of times and get 3 and 4 player working too. And it will just grab the controllers that are plugged into your machine. This is really useful for a few reasons. People often don't realize that split screen doesn't require replication because it's all local. So it's a really good way to just test a multiplayer idea, especially if you're ever doing a game jam and you're like, is this fun? You can very quickly just roll a split screen version of the game and be like, yes, it's fun. So having something like this is good for prototyping certain ideas, certain effects. Sometimes I use it to test effects to make sure that they look good from third person when I can't be bothered like putting things in the world. The next one I want to go into is animation fast path. So see these little lightning bolts that are above each node? These lightning bolts represent that node is the fastest it could be. So what happens is under the hood in Unreal, every single time we go to look up a variable in the anim graph, what we're actually doing is we've got two ways that we can do it. We can either say, hey, what variable is there plugged into this section of the anim graph? Or if that value has to go through an equation first, the engine needs to load up a virtual machine, do the calculations, and then pass that information back to the anim graph, okay? And what that means is bit by bit, you actually have very slow anim graphs because you're constantly initializing virtual machines just to calculate simple things. So this bottom one, even though it seems like it's only got 2 extra nodes, those multiplications by 0.5, when you're creating some sort of, I don't know, 100-player battle royale game, that could really add up. So if you've got a lot of enemies and you're handling a lot of skeletal meshes, be aware that not using FastPath really will affect your performance over time, and for no good reason. You know, if you do the same calculations in the event graph and then pass those results in, you're fine. It's just don't do them in the anim graph. Now, it is worth noting that there's a nice little thing that you can turn on that says warn about blueprint usage up top. So this is in the project settings, and what this actually does is it lets you, it throws up a warning anytime that anim graph does something in the anim graph that it should have done in the event graph. It will just warn you, and this is a good way to just nag you into doing the right thing over time, because the engine, it'll still compile and it'll still run, but the whole time it'll be like, dude, you could be doing this so much faster. So having that. Next up, we have the Asset Management Framework. So the Asset Management Framework was first added in 4.16. It's a global object. Now, it's a global object that allows you to kind of asynchronously load things into the editor. There's a really good example of this in the Action RPG project, which is free, and it's in the marketplace. It's by Epic. But you can check that out if you want to see more of it. But this really helps you remove hard references, which I'll get into a little bit later, because they can be quite troublesome for performance. Now, before I mentioned the VR work that we did for Robo Recall. Now, when we did Robo Recall, one of the big things that Epic handled was added a forward renderer, okay? And when the forward renderer was added, this was seen as a good way to handle VR. But what a lot of people forget is that sometimes a forward renderer is just more suitable to the project that you're doing. Maybe it's going to render things faster because you don't have any dynamic lights, or maybe it's going to be better because you really want a sharp image and MSAA is going to be more appropriate. My point is this: it's a forward renderer, it's not a VR renderer. And a lot of people immediately rule it out for their projects because they say, well, I'm not making a VR game. But keep in mind that, you know, just because it's not a VR game doesn't mean that technology isn't more suitable. I've seen this used to like really great usage in fighting games, for instance, because when you're doing fighting games, you know, there's not going to be too many lights on screen, so something like this works quite well. A nice little feature that came in, I think it was 4.15 or 16, is the lightweight rigid body simulation. Being aware that whenever you run whenever you want to run physics sims on characters, you can actually enable immediate mode. And immediate mode essentially runs the collision only against static geometry. It doesn't do the collision against any dynamic geometry. Because the thing is that by doing it this way, it's much, much more efficient. And if I want to blow up like 30 people at once, if you look at this, you don't really notice that they're not colliding with the other dynamic characters because there's 30 people flying in the air at once. You know, people are looking at the characters flying in the air. They're not noticing the little collisions that are no longer there anymore. And for a lot of games, this is really suitable and it's very easy to implement. So the world composition tool is something that Unreal has for handling extremely large environments. It gives you a nice little overhead view that allows you to automatically stream in different levels, and you can view them. You can actually right-click on any of these quads here. You can right-click on any sub-level and generate a static mesh for it, and the engine will automatically generate a nice little proxy so that when you're in different levels, you can see the version that's far away as a very efficient way to handle it. This is one of those things that, again, a lot of people aren't aware of. They often try and roll their own solutions. And sometimes making your own solution for your style of game really makes sense. It's also worth noting, though, that we have origin shifting built in. However, that doesn't work on listen servers. Origin shifting allows you to have theoretically unlimited sizes for your maps, because even if you were to get out of Unreal Engine's max size, it shifts the world back to 0, without anyone. So the next one to go into is overdraw. Now, overdraw is this issue that you can see here, okay? So see this black around this material? So even though those sections are invisible, they're still rendering. So even though they're invisible, you can still, technically the engine still needs to do its calculations before determining that they're invisible. So they add a lot of overhead. And when you have a bunch of particles like this that are overlapping one another, it gets out of hand pretty quickly. So what you can actually do is, if you're using Cascade, you can use particle cutout mode, and particle cutout mode will physically cut down, it'll create vertices to fit the shape of the texture being read into it, because quite often rendering a couple of extra vertices is way cheaper than rendering all of that overdraw. So strongly recommend you use it. It's currently only in Cascade, but we will have it coming to Niagara eventually. So this is really useful, and honestly this is one that I didn't know about until quite recently. So if you type in up top r.rhi cmd bypass 1, and then you go through and you read in r.rhi thread.enable 0, r.showMaterial draw events -1, and then you profile your GPU, the GPU profiler will actually physically go ahead and it will give you a draw cost for every single material in the scene. This is really useful because normally when you're looking at this in the scene, you know how expensive your frame is. But doing it this way, while you would never want to run the game like this, it gives you a really good way to look at the scene and say, oh, this material and this material have a lot of overhead. What's causing it? Okay? Not only that, but if you look at the log when you run this command, if you look at the log instead of the visual profiler, the log has a whole heap of extra information about the number of vertices and such for each material too. So it's pretty powerful, and it allows you to get a much better understanding of what's going on in your scene and what's really causing the problems. So the next one I want to get into is material functions as layers. So if you look at these three characters, it's worth noting that they have a lot of detail. Like when we zoom in, we can physically see detail like all the way down. Now when we do this, what's actually happening is we're actually using material functions as layers. So each material function is like leather or metal or carbon fiber or anything else. And what we're actually doing into each one is we're reading in an ID mask which says red is metal or blue is rubber or whatever else. And then this mask over here says where the scratches are, where the grime is, and where the ambient occlusion is. Now by making these part of the shader graph, what we end up with is a very easy way to generate new skins, because each material, like the metal, knows how it's meant to look when it's scratched, and the carbon fiber knows how it's meant to look when it's scratched. And we can just swap those two things out with color variation for instantly having really easy skins. This is a great way of handling large production. I quickly wanted to go into the stencil buffer because some people are unaware of it existing. So you can essentially render assets to a separate buffer. Now when you render assets to a separate buffer, you can do some really cool effects. Like you can say, hey, I can make the asteroid that's about to appear be visible through this portal, but nothing else be visible. Okay, so you can see just behind it, all of those little rocks and stuff are still visible on the other side of the portal. So using the stencil buffer for simple little VFX tricks can be quite powerful. Next thing I want to get into is pixel depth offset. So pixel depth offset is the act of getting the depth buffer and basically pushing that pixel further back. Now this is really useful when two things are overlapping one another, because if you imagine that, see how these rocks, when they're very close to the ground, if I push them behind the ground, we render the ground instead. When the depth buffer is in front, like it normally is, we would render the rock instead, okay? Now, by using a practice known as dithered temporal anti-aliasing, which is a node in the material graph, dithered temporal anti-aliasing basically randomizes whether the pixel is in front or behind, okay, whenever they're close. Now by randomizing whether they're in front or behind, temporal anti-aliasing blurs the two colors together, and what we're left with is, even though these are two opaque objects, as this thing starts touching the ground, it starts to get the color of the thing under it. which creates a really nice visual. Now, you don't use this on everything, obviously, but it can be really, really powerful for certain kinds of assets in certain situations, and it can really, really help your visuals because it helps you avoid that look of objects being just stuck to landscapes with that really clear-cut line. You know, whenever a rock is coming out of the ground, you always just see that strong edge of where the rock touches the ground. This is a nice way of really avoiding that. Now, many people are aware of world-aligned materials, which is the act of projecting something in world space. So you can see here that as this cube moves around, the brick stays in alignment as to where it was. This is really, really powerful for when your artist just gave you a terribly UV'd asset, but you've got to get the product out the door anyway. Sorry, did that sound too specific? When you're handling things like that, it's worth noting that there's another node that really comes in handy, which is pre-skinned local position. So here's the thing. If you look at this left one, we're using world alignment on this left character, okay? And it's projecting a checkerboard texture onto that character, okay? And you'll notice that as the character moves, the checkerboards are still aligned with the world, so they no longer line up with the character. It looks terrible, right? Here's the thing. This node, this is using pre-skinned local position, and what this actually does is this bakes out the position based on the character's default pose, okay? So if the character is T-posed, it gives you a position as if they were permanently like this. There's going to be a bunch of photos of me pulling that pose now, I can see it. But as the character is doing this, it means that as they move around, you don't see any distortion. And because you don't see any distortion, this is really useful for doing skins as well. Because I could project a camouflage onto one material that's not based off their UVs, but based off of their pre-skinned local position. You know, or I could project a decal onto the character that now means that if my gun is reloading, even though the magazine is being taken out and put back in, it still would have the spray paint as if it was spray painted when the magazine was still in the gun. Do you know what I mean? So this kind of power is really, really useful to have, and there's a lot of different times where this is super useful, and again, people just don't know about it. This is a simple one. It's a plugin that we have in the plugins section. It's the sun position calculator. So you can literally read in a place in the world, like a longitude and latitude, and you can say which direction north is, and then you can say what time of day it was on what date, and it will put the sun in the correct spot. And this is really useful for anyone in the room that's doing ArcViz. And it's there, it's free, it's one blueprint, easy to use. Mesh decals, there's a lot of people that don't really use them, but mesh decals are super powerful. Essentially, what you can do is have separate material IDs in which one of them is being projected onto the other. So in this situation, we can have the concrete as a consistent concrete material across all of our assets. And then the second ID is literally just projecting the destruction of the concrete onto those onto that specific asset. So if I was going to have 50 different pillars that all needed to look like they were busted up in different ways, this is a nice way of me sharing the exact same texture pool and everything else and just using simple mesh atlasing to kind of put that destruction in the right spot and just pass it off between everything. You may be unaware of this as well, but Unreal now features automatic LOD generation. So this has no LODs by default, but when we click that button, it automatically generated LODs. So we've automatically got different quality levels, and as we zoom out, we can see differences. So this has 2,500, 5,000, 11,000, and 22,000 polys for each variant. And the cool thing is this is auto-generated. You don't need to get an artist doing anything. And we also have rule sets that you can follow. So you can set up the rule sets and create your own. That means that whenever you import a new object, you can say, this object is a hero prop, and it will generate LODs appropriate for a hero. Or I could say that when this asset's coming in, it's a useless prop that we don't really care about, so generate ugly LODs, it's fine. But I can set up things appropriate. Now, it's not just static world. We also do skeletal mesh LODs now. So skeletal mesh LODs are built in, and you can tell them which bones to focus on. So if we were to look at this character, it's by default, it's got 3 LODs, but if we hit generate, after bringing in a rule set, we've now got 6 LODs. And if we look at the poly count for each of these, so this is the first LOD, this is the last LOD, which is hideous, 600 tries. But here we have 41,000 polys, 10,000 polys, 5,000 polys, 2,000 polys, 1,200 polys, and finally, the ugly one, there it is, 600 polys, okay? It was so ugly because it was meant to be looked at from that distance. But you can tell the generator to keep detail around certain bones. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through this one reasonably quickly. But it's worth noting that Unreal brought in something to help out fighting games quite a while ago. Basically, we've got a much nicer way of syncing up your VSync so that your input controls has a much smaller delay. This is a console command that you can enable now, but I've got to warn you, this works very well, especially if you've got VSync running. But the problem with it is that if you fall below your VSync, so if you fall below your expected frame rate, you increase the chance of hitching. But as long as you're able to stay above your expected frame rate, you have a much faster input for your games. Okay? Useful little thing, but again, people are unaware of it. If you look up that in the documentation, you'll find a much nicer breakdown. As we're running out of time, just be aware that you can at any point output a high-resolution screenshot by going to the arrow in the top of your viewport and clicking high-res screenshot. This will output a very nice image that you can scale up as necessary. This is really useful for ArcViz stuff, but honestly, it's also very useful whenever you're doing a banner or something like that for a show. This will just help you give the best result you can. You can disable shader permutations. So in the project settings, you can basically say, if I'm not going to use atmospheric fog, there's no reason for me to be building every material to use atmospheric fog. And you can just disable it. Next up, be aware that pixels aren't always the problem. If you scale down your screen percentage, by scaling down your screen percentage, you can do a very simple test to see if the visual overhead that you're having is coming from verts or if it's coming from pixels, okay? So this is a really nice way. If you scrunch it down and your frame rate doesn't change, it tells you that you're getting overhead elsewhere through your UVs or through verts or something else. Gonna skip ahead a little bit. We're nearly done. Avoid hard references in Blueprint. So be aware that if you have a blueprint that's casting to another blueprint, and that blueprint references a third blueprint, your game will automatically bring all of them into memory. So if I have a player character that references a main menu, and a main menu that directly references every gun in the game, or every weapon in the game, or whatever, every item in the game, my player character will always bring in all of my weapons and items in the game, because it brings in the main menu, and then it brings in everything else. So using things like the asset manager are a great way to avoid this. Almost done. So next up is plot function on graph. So this is a nice little material that node that people are unaware of, but you can actually output any of the functions that you're putting as a graph. It's a really nice way to kind of see what your actual data is doing if you're a bit confused by the results that you're seeing. So just feeding that in really helps you just get a better idea of what's going on in your game. Small toolbars. So again, at some point, you're probably going to realize that you're no longer reading the text of the icons in your editor. So just enable small toolbars in your general appearance. It's much nicer, much neater. Gives you just a little bit more like view space, and it makes you look like a pro. Be aware that for Niagara, you can disable interpolated spawning. So whenever you have a particle system in Niagara, by default, whenever it spawns a particle, it says, hey, should I have spawned particles between now and the previous frame? And if so, where should they be based on it spawning that time ago? That actually adds a lot of overhead, and if you're going to have a lot of particles and they're not going to see it anyway, you can disable interpolated spawning to get way more particles on screen with way less overhead. The VR editor is one of the last things I'm going to touch in this presentation. So the VR editor is often looked at as kind of gimmicky, and I thought it was too. But here's the thing. When you're actually modifying the world in VR, you get a much quicker idea of if something is the wrong size if you're making a game for VR. The other big advantage of using the VR editor is if you're building a game for VR, by building the level content in VR, you're able to actually see how it should look immediately, because you're seeing something for the Oculus in an Oculus, or something for Vive in Vive. Now, it's worth noting that whenever you want to put something out for AR, we have this nice little thing called world to meters scale. Now, this is a little bit cheeky, but it works. So every level in Unreal, you can actually load them as level instances, okay? Which means when you load the level, you can put it in a different position with a different rotation. Now, when you put it in a different position at a different rotation, you can actually use this world to meters scale to load a level in that's full size, but I could put it on my table. I could shrink it down and make it 1/10 the scale. This is really useful for product demonstrations, although be aware that in doing that, you're also going to mess with your trace distances and a few other things. Okay? Now, we've run out of time. My apologies, we don't have time for questions. But I hope this session has been useful. I've tried to cover a lot of information today, but thank you all very much for your time. And I'd like to get a round of applause as well for the interpreters, because they've been with me all day. Thank you.
Thank you.